Replacing the Frontier, American Male Collegiate Sports in the Early 20th Century by R.J. Morrison. During the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, the American frontier, which had for generations defined American masculinity, began closing. The West stopped being a near lawless land of, in their view, untamed wilderness filled with savages, and instead became a generally pretty normal part of the United States. Speaking at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, eminent historian Frederick J. Turner argued that the frontier and its mythology had been an essential part of forming the American cultural identity. He argued that the freedom that being on the edge of civilization, as he viewed it, allowed, let Americans develop their sense of masculinity and sense of freedom. Now that the frontier was closed, Americans looked for a way to replace it and ensure that white American men retained their vitality even when the need to stay alive through masculine means had disappeared. One solution many favored was athletics, especially in this period, college athletics. Athletics had existed for as long as humanity has, of course, but it was not a major part of the daily life of Americans for much of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The 1893 World's Fair in Chicago featured the Games of the World exhibition, where various American white ethnics showed off games from their home culture. Also at this event, one of the first nighttime games of gridiron football was played, with the experimental lights. The presence of sports in the 1893 Columbian Exposition showed the innovative aspect of the fairs. New technology was used to enhance old classics, and the broadening of horizons brought Americans into contact with new sports from distant lands. Also in 1893, Dartmouth College published a history of sports at their school, where they noted that for bodily exercises in the earliest years of the college, resort was held to the pursuits of agriculture and other forms of manual labor. This quotation shows how Americans viewed athletics. In the past, masculine virtue had been maintained by the necessity of agricultural production and hunting. Now they believed it could be sustained by athletics. Speaking at the quarter-centennial celebration for the state of Colorado in 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt talked of the mythology of the frontier. He reminded the audience of their masculine virtue and that their forefathers had shared it as well. Roosevelt himself was an ardent outdoorsman who pursued fishing, hunting, and all other forms of outdoor sport. Proponents of sports said that it could help many issues, such as urban restlessness, race relations, and labor relations, and preventing emasculation. The 1904 Olympics were, of course, going to be the capstone of this development. In a 1904 article about athletics in the St. Louis and Clark Centennial Exposition brochure published in the Cosmopolitan, John Brisbane Walker wrote that, as into everything else in 1904, reason is being interjected into physical training. It is custom, is no longer sufficient to explain idiotic methods. Students ask themselves the why and the wherefore, and get their answers from the health periodicals in a way that makes old foggy schoolmasters often expose themselves to ridicule. America was not the only country that was experiencing athletic development, of course. Back in Europe, inspired by many of the same concerns as their American counterparts, Europeans were returning to a tradition that had not been seen since the time of Theodosius I in ancient Rome, the Olympic Games. Starting with the 1900 French Olympics, they had been associated with World's Fairs, to the chagrin of Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of modern Olympics. The International Olympic Committee was given minimal control over the events in France and turned towards America for the next Olympics. Initially agreeing to Chicago, the IOC was persuaded to change at the last minute to coincide with the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. The 1904 Olympics stretched from May to November 1904. They began with a rather muted ceremony where organizer David Francis and U.S. Secretary of State John Milton Hay crossed a simple field and assumed position viewing the games. More spectators came to the 1904 Olympics than had come to the previous ones in Athens and France. Still, though, in America, little emphasis was placed on the Olympics. Campbell's Illustrated Guide to the Fair completely ignores the Olympics, for example. However, the athletics in St. Louis were much bigger than their counterparts in Chicago had been. Both were constructed to be disassembled after the events ended. However, the St. Louis Olympic grounds were orders of magnitude larger, allowing for more spectators and more athletes. Built on Washington University, the Olympics boasted that they had constructed the greatest track in American history. They also created gymnasiums and a model playground to spread the message of good health to children flocking to the fair. Additionally, as opposed to past athletic displays, which had emphasized the act of doing sport, the Olympics emphasized the aspect of watching sports. Planners cared just as much about displaying national pride and a good show as they did about the quality of competition. Despite trying to spread the global unity, the St. Louis Olympics were distinctly American in character. In total, 687 athletes competed, with 526 of those being Americans and 56 being Canadians. The remainder of the athletes mostly came from England, Scotland, Ireland. Interestingly, Ireland and England and Scotland were listed separately. Australia, Germany, and France. Almost all the medal winners were Americans. Despite their modern international reputation, the 1904 Olympics were distinctly American. Fair organizers tapped James Edward Sullivan, an Olympic proponent and advocate for American sports, to organize the games, and under his leadership, the fair took on a distinctly nationalist tone, emphasizing American unity and the physical virtue of the American people. To the chagrin of the IOC, Sullivan also included many non-Olympic sports in the same venues under the Olympic banner, such as intercollegiate basketball and YMCA national competitions. Instead of being an international spectacle, the 1904 Olympics were a display of largely American performance, with American athletes fighting for American glory. It is fitting that men's college sports played such a big role in the distinctly American showcase of athletic prowess, because over the recent years and the years immediately following, American college athletics had risen to a prominent place in American consciousness and undergone a massive transformation of their own. Basketball had been invented in 1891 by a graduate student in Springfield, Massachusetts, who was seeking to find a way to keep athletes engaged and physical during the winter months where it was too cold to play outside. After playing the first few games in the local Springfield area, the game spread by word of mouth to the surrounding schools. By the end of the decade, numerous colleges had begun setting up men's basketball teams, including the University of Kansas, which hired the game's inventor. Today, he still holds the record as the only University of Kansas coach in their basketball history to maintain a losing record. At the same time, football was also going through a development process. The development of gridiron football is long and goes back far farther in the past than can be covered here. But by the early 20th century, college football had become one of the most popular sports in the country. Professional football as we know it today would not emerge until after the First World War. Then, as now, it was a violent and bloody sport. Out of all the attempts for American men to replicate the legendary warrior culture of their ancestors, football and boxing probably came the closest to matching them. During the 1905 college football season, 18 players died as a result of the game. Just like today, many people raised concerns over the danger involved with the sport, and many called for its outright abolition. President Roosevelt, however, took a middle stance. He called for the game to be made safer, but did not give in to calls for its ban. Along the East Coast, elite universities with cutting-edge football programs began utilizing a new maneuver, the forward pass, which soon became one of the cornerstones of American football. Pop Warner is often credited with innovating the move. Before coaching college, he had worked in Indian boarding schools, where Native American students were pitted against white students from rival schools. Academic football was not the only place where white athletes tried to prove their athletic powers over other races. Another competition was being held simultaneously with the 1904 Olympics, which attracted far more attention than the Olympics and collegiate competitions. The so-called Anthropology Games, organized by the Olympic planners in conjunction with the fair's Department of Anthropology, pitted, in quotes, civilized athletes against, in quotes, savages. These games were designed to prove the white supremacist theories of the organizers. Native competitors, drawn from the tribal village displays at the World's Fair, were not given a real chance at winning, often being instructed on the sport's rules only immediately before they were expected to compete. Despite this, however, the Anthropology Days proved a huge draw, bigger than the regular Olympics. Contemporary reviewers said that the performances at the so-called tribal games were much better and more exciting than the Olympics had been. In the context of the martial value of sports, the tribal games became the new way to prove white supremacy. Instead of outright conflict between Native Americans and white Americans, as had occurred in the 19th century, now it took place in the controlled environment of the sporting arena. Of course, men were not the only ones attempting to start college athletics during this period. Believing that physical health was essential for women as well as men, many schools set up athletic programs for both. However, as far as competitive sports, women were always at a disadvantage. Many women fought for programs at their colleges, but even when they were successful, they were relegated compared to their male equivalents. When programs were established, poorer records were kept than the male programs, making research for historians difficult. Men viewed athletics as an extension of masculinity, and therefore they did not much care for women's athletic endeavors. The Olympics captured the imagination of the American people, for better or worse. Americans like Teddy Roosevelt believed that the athletic spirit that events like this promoted was good for the physical and societal health of the nation. With the West closed, Americans looked for new ways to ensure that they did not lose their masculinity, and in the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, they found sporting. It is fitting that the St. Louis's World's Fair marked the anniversary of Lewis and Clark's expedition, as well as the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. More than any other fair before, it emphasized athletic achievement and celebrated the anniversary of the frontier and exploration. The two together were intermingled in the mind of many Americans with the ideals of masculine virtue.